The road from Dover had taken 4 days. 4 days of rain-soaked wool and axle grease and the particular silence of a man who had stopped expecting anything from the horizon. The coach had thrown a wheel outside Maidstone, lost a shoe outside Faversham, and sunk axle-deep into a ditch somewhere between the two, leaving him to sit in the tilting dark while the driver cursed at the mud. He had counted the curses. It had kept him from thinking that he should have been planning. There was a list of things a man in his position ought to be doing with 4 days in a rattling box. Calculating the outstanding debt against any realistic sale price, drafting the language he would need to use with the solicitor, deciding what, if anything, inside the house was worth transporting before the buyer took possession. He had the figures in a leather case on the seat beside him. He had not opened it since Canterbury. Instead he had watched the rain and turned the bare place on his left hand where a ring had been. He had sold it in Dover. A garnet set in yellow gold, his mother's, the last thing in his coat pocket that a pawnbroker would touch. It had bought him the coach ticket and one meal and nothing else. The indentation it left in his finger was still there, a pale groove worn into the skin after years of wearing. And he found himself pressing his thumb against it at odd moments, the way a man probes a sore tooth, not because it felt good, but because it was the one sensation that was still entirely his. Ashford Hall. He had not said the name aloud in 7 years that he had left on a Wednesday in November of 1849, the morning after his father's coffin went into the ground. And he had not looked back at the gate because he had been 26 and certain that London was the thing and the county was the past, and there was no version of himself that would need to return to a draughty Tudor pile in Kent to live out his father's life. That certainty had lasted approximately 3 years before a man named Carew had stood up in a committee room in Westminster and begun to read aloud from a set of documents that did not exist. That he pressed his thumb against the groove in his finger and watched the dark. The coach stopped at the crossroads above the village. The driver would go no further. The lane to the hall was not maintained, he said, and he was not risking the undercarriage on whatever state the surface was in. Dominic paid him without argument. He had one bag. He had learned, in 7 years of moving between rooms that were not his, to travel with very little. The lane was worse than the driver had imagined. He walked the last mile in water up to his boot tops, feeling the ground give and suck beneath each step. The hedge lines on either side so overgrown they formed a tunnel. He had walked this lane every day of his childhood. He had run it, once, racing his father's horse on a bet he had lost. He could not find the version of himself that had done that. It seemed to belong to someone who had not yet understood what things could be taken. The gates stood open, not broken open, as though someone had passed through recently and not troubled to close them behind. He stopped and looked at this for a moment. Then he walked through. The drive was worse. 7 years of nothing had let the elms go to war with each other overhead. Their branches laced into a ceiling that turned the November dark absolute. He walked by memory, placing his feet where the gravel had been, skirting the place where the ornamental pond had a tendency to overflow in heavy rain. Once he put his foot through something that had been, at some point, a wooden garden bench. He did not stop. The house appeared between the trees as a mass of dark chimneys against the cloud, the outline of the east wing's gabled roof, the pale suggestion of the stone facade. No light in any window. He had not expected light. He had expected exactly this. A stopped thing, a property, an asset with a market value and a debt against it, and nothing more. He was reaching for the door handle when he smelled it, candle wax. The specific sweetness of a tallow candle burned down to its last inch, a smell that required a room, a wick, a hand that had struck the match. He stood with his fingers around the iron handle and breathed it in. A house left empty for 7 years did not smell of candle wax. He opened the door. The entrance hall was dark. He stood in it and let his eyes work. And gradually the shapes assembled themselves, the staircase, the hearth, the long case clock that had stopped, as he recalled, sometime in 1843 and had never been repaired. All of it was where it had been. The smell was stronger here, candle wax and something else, something green, like dried herbs. He followed it. The drawing room door was ajar. Through it came a thin line of orange light, and he pushed it open and stopped. A child was sitting on the hearthrug. A boy, 5 or 6 years old, slight and dark-haired, with the focused expression of someone engaged in serious work. He had a piece of charcoal in his hand and was drawing on the back of what appeared to be a dismantled flour sack spread flat on the floor. The fire had burned low but was still giving off heat. And in its light the boy's face was copper and shadow. He was drawing the house. Even from the doorway Dominic could see it, the roofline, the chimneys, the gates with their 7 stone posts. The boy looked up. He did not scream. He did not scramble to his feet. He looked at Dominic with the frank, unhurried assessment of a child who has not yet learned to perform fear for the benefit of adults, and said, in a tone of polite inquiry, "Are you lost, sir?" Dominic opened his mouth. "Closed it, Thomas." The voice came from the corridor behind him, low, controlled, with the particular flatness of someone speaking quietly because they had decided to. He turned. She was standing 3 feet away, holding an oil lamp at shoulder height. She had clearly been moving fast. There was a flush across her cheekbones and her hair had come half down on one side. She was younger than he had expected, mid-20s at most, and she was dressed not like a servant and not like a lady but like someone who had solved the problem of available clothing practically and without vanity. Our eyes were gray. They moved from his face to his bag to his boots, still dripping on the flagstones, and then back to his face. She did not step back, instead she raised the lamp slightly, angling it upward so the light fell on him from below, and looked at him with the expression of someone conducting an inventory. "You shouldn't talk to strangers without calling me first," she said, and it took him a moment to understand she was still addressing the child. Then those gray eyes came back to him. "Who are you?" The fire cracked. Rain hit the window in a gust and subsided. Dominic looked at her. He looked at the child on the hearth rug, who had set down his charcoal and was now watching them both with open interest. He looked at the lamp in her hand, a lamp that had been lit, which meant oil. Which meant someone had been buying oil, which meant, "It's still raining," he said. She waited. Her expression did not change. "That if you have a dry room," he said, "I won't trouble you for long." Something moved in her face, not softness, not relief, but a kind of rapid recalculation. A measuring of new variables against existing ones. Then she lowered the lamp. "The east room is made up," she said. "There's a bolt on the inside." She turned before he could answer. "Thomas. It's past your hour. Leave the drawing where it is, but I haven't finished the gates. Tomorrow." He stood in the entrance hall and listened to the sounds of a child being put to bed in a house that was legally, without question, entirely his. The creak of the second stair, the murmur of her voice, the soft close of a door. Then silence, except for the rain. He did not move for a long time. He was still standing there when she came back down. She stopped on the bottom step, which put them at the same height, and looked at him with the same gray attention as before. Only quieter now, the performance of competence temporarily suspended, replaced by something more direct. "You're not going to tell me who you are," she said. "It was not quite a question." "Not tonight," he said, "and you expect me to show you to a room in my house?" He started. And stopped. She raised her eyebrows very slightly. He said nothing. A long moment passed. The rain found a gap somewhere in the roof and began to drip, steadily, into what sounded like a cooking pot. Somewhere she had placed a cooking pot under a leak, which meant she knew where the leaks were. Which meant, "My name is Eliza," she said finally. "I have been here since April. I don't know what your claim to this place is. And am not asking tonight. But I will ask in the morning." She stepped down off the final stair. "The east room is at the end of the corridor. There's a candle on the sill. Don't use more of it than you need. Candles are expensive." She walked past him toward the kitchen without looking back. He stood alone in the dark entrance hall of his father's house, his bag at his feet, the rain finding its way through the roof at 3 distinct points now, and looked at the staircase going up. Since April. 7 months. She had been here 7 months, and she knew where the leaks were. And she had a child, and she had put a cooking pot under each one, and she had not asked him who he was because He picked up his bag. She had not asked because she already suspected, or because she had learned, from whatever had brought her here, that some questions were better left until morning. That he climbed the stairs in the dark, his hand on the banister, and did not look at any of the closed doors he passed. The east room smelled of dried lavender and damp plaster. That he set his bag on the floor and did not unpack it. There was a candle on the windowsill, as she had said, and a box of matches beside it. He lit it. The flame showed him a room that had been lived in recently, not by him, not in the current occupation, but recently in geological terms, sometime in the past decade. Which in this house meant after his departure. The bed was made with sheets that did not belong to the original linen cupboard. They were plain cotton, well washed. The kind bought from a market rather than inherited. Someone had put a rug over the place where the floorboards warped. Someone had wedged a folded piece of card under the leg of the washstand to stop it rocking. She had done all of this. That he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the candle and did not think about this directly. Thinking about it directly would require him to arrive at a set of conclusions about what it meant that a woman he did not know had spent 7 months making a livable space out of the wreck of his inheritance. And those conclusions had implications he was not equipped to handle tonight. That he was here to sell the house. That he repeated this to himself with the deliberate flatness of a man reading from a list. He was here to sell the house. He would be here for as long as it took to locate the title deeds, confirm the outstanding debt to Caro's people, and make contact with the solicitor in Maidstone who had been managing the estate in absentia. A week, perhaps 2. Then he would leave England. There was nothing to discuss. The candle flame moved in a draught from the window frame, and he watched it. That he thought about the child's voice. "Are you lost, sir?" The question had been so precisely, accidentally correct that it had lodged in him sideways, the way a splinter did when you didn't remove it immediately. Not lost in the navigational sense. Lost in the sense that he had been in motion for 7 years, room to room, city to city. The particular sustained displacement of a man who cannot afford to stop and had arrived in this house not because he wanted to be here but because there was nowhere left that would take him. And the child had looked at him and asked the obvious question. The question that nobody who knew what he was had the frankness to ask. And it had not felt like an accusation. It had felt like an inquiry. That he pressed his thumb against the groove where the ring had been. That he should go down and tell her who he was. That he knew this. The pragmatic calculus was simple. She was occupying his property without legal right. He was the legal owner. The appropriate action was to establish this clearly and immediately. He had done nothing wrong by not saying it tonight. He had been wet and exhausted and the child had been there and it was past 10 o'clock. In the morning, he would go downstairs. And he would tell her his name and his title and explain that he needed the house cleared for sale within a reasonable time frame, and she would. He stopped. She would have nowhere to go. That he was certain of this. Not from sentiment but from observation. A woman who had been in a place since April and still knew where to find the cooking pots and still could not afford to waste a candle was not a woman with a comfortable alternative. She had said since April, and I have been here, with the same flatness he used himself when he was describing something. He had not chosen but had made into a fact. She was here because here was the only option. She had taken a house that had no one in it and put someone in it. And the someone she had put there was a child who drew the gate posts from memory. This was not his problem. That he lay back on the bed and stared at the plaster ceiling. There was a crack running from the rose to the northeast corner. It had not been there before. Or perhaps it had been. And he had not looked at ceilings at 26, being occupied with more important things. He thought about what he had considered important at 26, and found he could not reconstruct the certainty of it. That I in the morning, he told himself. He would explain clearly that he did not sleep for a long time. When he did, he dreamed of nothing, which was the best he generally managed. Across the corridor, Eliza was also not sleeping. She sat at the small table by the window of the room she shared with Thomas and looked at the list she had been maintaining in the back of a flour merchant's order book she had found in the kitchen. It was the inventory she kept: candles remaining, oil for the lamp, flour and dried beans, salt, the state of the roof over the east wing, the crack above the drawing-room window that was widening. She had been keeping it since May. When she had realized that if anything happened to her there would need to be a record of what the house required. She did not know why she thought this way. It was simply that she had always made lists. Lists were the architecture of not being surprised. She looked at the most recent entry. Made 3 days ago. Unknown someone has been on the drive. Boot prints in the mud near the gate. Single person. Not Caro's men, they come in pairs. Wait, she had written wait because she had learned that waiting was almost always the correct response to uncertainty. Acting on incomplete information was how you ended up. Standing in a magistrate's office explaining yourself, she thought about the man in the east room that he was tall. She had registered this in the doorway, the way he filled it. Not with aggression but with the unconscious occupation of space that men who had been significant somewhere tended to carry with them even after the significance was gone. His coat was ruined. His boots were ruined. His bag was small enough to suggest that whatever he had come from. He had not come with resources. He had stood in the entrance hall of this house and looked at the staircase and the stopped clock in the dark with the expression not of a stranger encountering an unfamiliar place but of a person looking at something they had expected to feel differently about. He had not told her his name, she had not told him her real one either, not fully. She had given him Eliza, which was true, and she had not told him the rest. She looked at Thomas, asleep in the small bed against the wall, one hand fisted under his cheek. The drawing he hadn't finished still on his mind, she could tell by the way his fingers twitched. Are you lost, sir? She almost smiled. She had not taught him that. She had taught him not to open doors to strangers. And he had opened a door to a stranger and invited him in with the most accurate question possible. The man had not answered. He had said it's still raining, which was the most specific kind of deflection, not a lie, not a refusal, but an acknowledgement that the real answer was not available yet. She had recognized this. She had used it herself that in the morning she would ask him directly. She had learned that directness, deployed at the right moment with the right expression, was frequently more effective than any amount of strategic patience. She would look at him over whatever breakfast she could assemble and she would say, now. Who are you, and what do you want with this house? And if he was who she had begun. In the 40 minutes since he had walked through the door, to suspect he might be. She closed the order book. If he was who she suspected. Then everything she had spent 7 months building was standing on a surface that had just shifted. And she would need to think very carefully about what came next. She looked at the bare finger of her left hand. No ring, never a ring, nothing to lose in that particular direction, and thought. In the morning, then, she blew out the lamp. In the dark, the rain continued. He was up before her. She knew this because when she came downstairs at 6:30 with Thomas still asleep behind a closed door, the kitchen fire had already been lit. Not well, whoever had done it had used too much wood at once and not enough kindling, and it was burning hot and fast in a way that would need managing, but lit, which meant he had been down here before dawn, feeling his way around a kitchen that was not familiar to him, and had decided that a fire was something he could contribute. She stood in the doorway and looked at this for a moment, then she filled the kettle and hung it over the grate and did not remark on it. She heard him before she saw him, footsteps overhead, slow and deliberate, moving room by room through the upper floor with the careful tread of someone who is trying not to sound like what they are, which was a person conducting an inspection. She tracked his progress by the creaks. He went through the east wing first, then across to the main corridor. Thina Posito, the room at the far end, which had been his father's study, and which she kept locked. The footsteps stopped outside that door. She counted to 15. Then they moved on. She exhaled and turned back to the kettle. By the time he appeared in the kitchen doorway, she had tea made and bread toasting on the rack, and she had arranged herself at the table with the flour merchant's order book open in front of her because she had decided last night that the correct approach this morning was to be visibly, pragmatically busy rather than to appear to have been waiting. She looked up when he came in and gave him the same direct attention she had given him last night, measuring him in the morning light that he looked worse in daylight. The coat was genuinely ruined. She could see now that the lining had been repaired in at least 3 places, and not expertly. His face was the face of a man somewhere in his middle 30s who had been sleeping badly for a number of years, fine drawn, with the particular tension around the eyes of someone who had trained himself not to show things. He had shaved. Which surprised her. He must have found the kit in the washstand drawer. She had put it there in June when she had found it in a trunk in the attic, wrapped in oilcloth, Emil Dha in silver. D.H. She had looked at those initials for a long time in June. There's T. She said that he came in and sat down at the other end of the table without being invited, which she noted. Not aggression assumption. The assumption of a person who was accustomed to sitting down in rooms without requiring permission. He poured his own tea and looked at the order book, inventory. He said, maintenance record. He was quiet for a moment. How long has the east gutter been failing? She looked at him. Since before I arrived. The damage to the ceiling in the east bedroom is from at least 2 winters ago. Maybe 3 at the crack above the drawing room window. Is moving. Approximately a 1/4 inch since September. She turned a page. The roof over the old dairy is gone entirely. On the north face. I've been keeping that room closed. There's no point heating a space that's open to the sky. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, something between assessment and something more complicated than assessment, and then looked back at his tea. You've been thorough. He said, I've been practical, she said. There's a difference. Thomas arrived 20 minutes later, sleep-creased and cheerful, and stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw the man at the table. He had inherited, from somewhere, a quality of absolutely unself-conscious evaluation that Eliza had long since stopped trying to moderate. You're still here, Thomas said. That I am, the man said. Are you going to stay? A pause. I haven't decided. Thomas considered this. Mama said we might have to leave soon. She didn't say why. He climbed onto the bench beside Eliza and reached for the bread. Are you the reason, Thomas? Eliza said. That I am one of them. The man said. She looked at him sharply. It was the most honest thing he had said since he arrived, and he had said it to a 6-year-old without apparent calculation. Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied, and began to eat. The morning passed in a state of armed neutrality. He went back upstairs after breakfast. She worked through her list: the loose hinge on the scullery door, the dwindling oil supply, the question of whether there was enough flour to last the week. She tried the locked study door once, from habit, and found it still locked. And stood in the corridor for a moment thinking about the initials on the shaving kit and the way he had looked at the staircase last night. She had not been wrong in June. She was certain she was not wrong now. The question was what to do about being right. She found him in the late afternoon and the long gallery on the upper floor, standing in front of a row of portraits with his hands behind his back. She had not meant to seek him out. She had come upstairs to check the window latch in the green room, which had a tendency to blow open in high wind, and had been doing so all day. But the gallery door was open, and she could see him from the corridor, and she stopped. He was looking at the third portrait from the left. A man of about 50, painted in the formal style of 20 years ago, with gray at his temples and the same quality of held tension around the jaw that she recognized from the face at her kitchen table. The nameplate at the bottom of the frame read, George Henry Ashford, 6th Duke of Ashford. 17981849. She watched him look at his father. He stood there for a long time without moving, his hands very still behind his back. He had the quality, in that moment, of a person who was not performing anything, not composure, not indifference, not the careful management of expression he maintained downstairs. He was simply standing in front of a dead man's portrait and being, privately, whatever he needed to be. She should have moved away. She knew this. Instead, she stood in the corridor doorway and watched. And when he finally spoke, she understood that he had known she was there. He would have fixed the gutters, he said. He did not turn around. In the first week, he would have been up a ladder himself, which my mother would have considered undignified. And he would have had the whole east wing sorted before winter. A pause. He was practical. It was the thing about him I understood least at the time. She came into the gallery. She walked to where he was standing and looked at the portrait. He looks like someone who kept lists. She said that he made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, arrested. He had a logbook for every year since 1821. Weather, repairs, crop yields, notable events. I found them in the study once when I was a boy, 30 years of his handwriting in identical brown books. And I thought it was the most tedious thing I had ever seen. He looked at the portrait for another moment. I've thought about those books a great deal in the last 7 years, they're still there, she said. That he turned to look at her. I in the study. I found them when I first arrived. On the bottom shelf behind the desk. I locked the room because she stopped. Because I thought they should be left alone. The silence that followed was different from the silences downstairs. Downstairs they had been strategic. Each of them thinking behind the quiet. This one was something else. Thank you, he said. He said it as though he was out of practice with the words and was trying to place them correctly. She nodded. She did not tell him she had read them. She had, all 30 years of them. In the long evenings of April and May when Thomas was asleep and the house was making its night sounds around her and she had needed to understand what kind of place this was and who had made it. She knew that in the logbook for 1848, the final entry for December read: D. Departed for London in good spirits and with high purpose. I find I have little to say on the matter that I have not said to him directly. Weather, frost. First of the season, she had not told him this. She would not. Not yet. The fever came on suddenly. The way fevers did with small children without warning, like a door blown open by wind. One moment Thomas was himself grumbling about being made to come in from the garden where he had been conducting some investigation involving a stick and the remains of the old kitchen garden wall. The next he was hot to the touch and silent, which was worse than the grumbling. And then he was in bed with his eyes closed and his breathing shallow and too fast. And Eliza was standing beside the bed with her hands very still at her sides and her mind running through what she had and what she didn't have. She had willow bark. She had bought it in the village in October because she had known the winter was coming and she had a child. She did not have enough. She did not have a doctor. The nearest doctor was 4 miles away in the village, which was 4 miles in driving rain and near dark, and she had no horse and no money for a message. Anne. What does he have? She turned. The man was in the doorway. He had heard. Apparently. She had not tried to be quiet. Fever, she said. He was fine an hour ago. That he came into the room without being asked and put his hand on Thomas' forehead with a directness that surprised her, not hesitant, not performatively gentle. But the straightforward assessment of someone who had done this before. He checked the pulse at the boy's wrist. He looked at the color of his face. Has he had this before? Once. Last winter. It broke in 2 days. What brought it down? Willow bark tea. Cold cloths. I sat up with him. That he was quiet for a moment. Then, there's a medicine cabinet in the main bedroom on the 2nd floor. My mother's. I don't know what's still usable, but there was dried peppermint in it when I last saw it. And dried yarrow. If they haven't turned to dust. He straightened up. Look, you don't have to. He was already gone. She heard him on the stairs, and then his footsteps overhead. And then the particular sound of a cupboard being opened. She turned back to Thomas and pressed a cool cloth to his forehead and talked to him quietly. The low continuous murmur she had discovered worked better than silence for keeping a frightened child calm even when the child appeared to be unconscious. That he came back in 12 minutes. He had the peppermint dried but intact. Still fragrant when he crushed a leaf between his fingers to show her, and the yarrow, and a small amber bottle of something he set on the nightstand with the label toward her. Laudanum, he said. If the fever goes above a certain point and he can't rest. Not before that I know. She said. That I know you know. He pulled the chair from the corner and set it beside the bed and sat down. I'll watch him while you make the tea. The peppermint goes in first, then the yarrow when it's off the boil, or it goes bitter. She looked at him. Why, father had a chest condition. He said. He was looking at Thomas, not at her. Winter was difficult. I learned what was in that cabinet. She took the herbs and went downstairs. When she came back with the tea he was still in the chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. watching the boy's face with an attention that had no performance in it. Thomas had stopped the too fast breathing. His color was a little better. The man had, apparently, continued to talk to him in her absence. She could tell from the quality of the quiet. The particular absence of tension in the room that meant the talking had only just stopped. She set the tea to cool and stood in the doorway. What did you say to him? She asked at a pause. I told him about the kitchen garden. What grew there? He seemed interested in the wall earlier. He sat back. I told him the stones in the far corner came from a Roman road. I don't know if that's true. My father told me it was. And I never verified it. Thomas stirred and didn't wake. He'll want to investigate that tomorrow. She said that I know. Something moved in his face. That's why I said it. She sat down on the edge of the bed and picked up the cooling tea and began the slow work of getting a half-conscious child to drink, and he stayed in the chair. And neither of them spoke for a long time. The fire burned down and she built it back up without asking, because the room needed to be warm, and he did not offer to help because she didn't need help. And this arrangement was arrived at without discussion. Sometime past midnight Thomas' fever broke. She felt it happen under her hand, the shift from dry heat to the damp warmth of a child sweating through the worst of it, the breathing easing. The small body losing its terrible rigidity. She exhaled. Thank you, she said. She was looking at Thomas, not at him. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, he said, the cabinet has linseed oil as well. If the cough develops. And there's elderflower in the. He paused. In the old dairy. Or there was. I don't know if it survived. I know, she said. I found it in September. He looked at her. I've been through most of the outbuildings. She said. I told you. I've been practical. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and put the chair back in the corner and said, call me if the fever comes back. I will. He got to the door and stopped. He didn't turn around. His father, he said. Is he? No. She said. There's no one else. He nodded once, a small motion, and left. She sat alone with her sleeping child and the dying fire and thought about a man who had gone, without being asked, to find medicine in a cabinet he had not opened in 7 years. And had known exactly what was in it because he had learned it for someone else a long time ago, and had sat in a chair through the night talking to a child he had no obligation to, and had carefully, deliberately, said something that would give the boys something to look forward to in the morning. She looked at her hands. In the morning, she had told herself last night, I will ask him directly. She had not asked him anything this morning. She had the sense she would not be asking tomorrow either. Thomas recovered in the way children did, completely, and with an air of mild indignation at having been confined to bed. As though the fever had been an imposition visited upon him by external forces rather than something his own body had produced. By the second morning he was eating normally. By the third he was back at the kitchen garden wall with his stick, investigating the Roman road theory with the systematic dedication of someone who intended to produce findings. The household had shifted in some way that Eliza could not precisely name. It was not warmer. Exactly. He was not a warm man in any obvious sense. It did not make conversation for its own sake, did not fill silence with pleasantries, did not ask Thomas questions about his interests in the effortful way of adults who did not know what to do with children. But he was present in a different way than he had been in the first 2 days. He appeared at meals without being called. He had begun, without discussion, to do things. The kitchen fire in the mornings, a section of loose fencing he had apparently noticed and replaced with materials found in the old stable. A blocked downspout that had been sending water down the east wall all autumn and that she had been meaning to address for weeks. He did not mention any of this. He did not appear to expect acknowledgement. He simply did the things and moved on. And she found herself watching him in the way she watched the house, with the attention she gave to systems that were behaving differently than expected. She still had not asked him his name. He still had not offered it. They were, she had concluded, in an arrangement that suited them both for reasons that were not identical. He needed to remain unannounced. She had gathered this much from the fact that he had not been to the village, had asked her to collect the post from the gate rather than the village post office. had become very still. On the one occasion a cart had come up the Lania farmer delivering winter fodder to the wrong address. Anne had stepped back from the window with the unhurried economy of someone practiced at not being seen. Whatever had happened to him, and she knew, broadly, what had happened to him. The logbook stopped in 1849, and the rest was the kind of story that reached even Eliza's corner of London in those years. The name in the papers, the committee hearing, the verdict was not ready to be findable, and she needed him to stay. Because a house with a duke in it, even an unannounced and technically ruined one, was a house that Caro's men might hesitate to simply walk into. She had not told him about Caro's men yet, she was waiting for the right moment. Which was the kind of thing she told herself when she was not quite ready to introduce a complication. The afternoon they finally really talked, for the first time. Without either of them managing the conversation from behind their respective precautions. Began with bread. She had been making it since morning, which was an all-day project in a kitchen where the oven temperature was unreliable and the flour was the last of what she had bought in October. He had come in around 2 in the afternoon, muddy from some project in the outbuildings, and had stopped at the sight of the floury wreckage on the kitchen table with an expression that was, briefly, almost unguarded. "Why mother made bread on Tuesdays," he said. "This is Thursday." She said, "I make it when there's flour." He washed his hands at the pump and sat down at the table without being asked. He had stopped asking, she noticed. Sometime around the second day, he had simply begun to move through the house as though his being in it were a fact rather than a question. "You grew up in London?" he said. She glanced at him. It was the first personal question he had asked directly. "East Southwark," she said. "You?" A slight pause at the reciprocation. "Here," he said. "And school?" "And then London, later. You didn't want to come back." "No, and now you're here, and now I'm here." He agreed. He watched her work the dough. "You said you had nowhere else to go when you arrived." "That's true, you don't have to tell me why." She looked at him again, more carefully. He had said it with the flatness of a man who had been on the receiving end of being told he had to explain himself, and had not liked it, and had decided not to do it to other people. "I was a housemaid," she said, "in Kensington for 4 years. She turned the dough. "Though Ma's father Wash was in the house. Not the master. A guest. Of a particular kind of frequency. He made certain promises that it turned out he was not in a position to keep, because he was already keeping them to someone else." She kept her eyes on the dough. "When it became impossible to hide what had happened, I was let go. He was not." She paused. "That's the usual arrangement." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of her hands on the dough. "I stayed in London for a year," she said. "I found work where I could. But Thomas was." She stopped. Started again. "A woman with a child and no husband and no character reference from her last employer has a limited number of options." She folded the dough over. "I had a letter from before one of the guests at the house in Kensington. Anne had said, once, that if I ever needed." She stopped again. "It was a kindness. The kind people offer when they don't expect to be taken up on it, and the letter brought you here." "The letter brought me here." He was quiet for a moment. "Was the letter from my father?" She had been waiting for this. She had thought about how she would answer it, in the evenings, when Thomas was asleep. "No," she said. "It was from your mother." He said nothing. She did not look at him. She shaped the loaf and set it on the tin and carried it to the oven. And by the time she turned back he had composed himself, or recomposed himself, or done whatever he did when something had reached him. "She was kind," he said. "To people she thought needed it." "She was," Eliza said. "I never met her. But the letter weighs it was very like what you'd expect from someone kind." He looked at his hands on the table. "She died in 1851, he said. I couldn't come back for the burial." A pause. "I got the news 3 months late. Someone sent it to the wrong city." "I am sorry," she said. "Are you going to ask me what happened?" He said. "You know something. You've known it since I arrived." I can see it in the way you don't ask. She sat down across from him. That I know what was in the papers in 1849. She said carefully. And I know that the papers are written by people who know what they've been paid to say. She met his eyes. I haven't asked because it's your business, and because I've been waiting to see what kind of person you were before I decided what I thought about the rest of it, and now. I think, she said, that a man who sits up all night with a child that isn't his and lies about Roman roads so the child has something to look forward to in the morning is not the kind of man the papers described. That he looked at her for a long moment. That I was set up. He said. By a man named Caro. Documents were falsified. I had enemies in the committee and no allies willing to speak publicly, and by the time I understood how completely I'd been outmaneuvered there was nothing left to do but take the verdict and leave before it got worse. He said it flatly. Without appeal, the way a man stated a fact he had long ago stopped expecting anyone to believe. She nodded. That I know about Caro. She said. That he holds the debt on this house. She said. He's been trying to have me removed since July. His men have come twice. I told them I was the housekeeper. That the estate was under legal review and they had no right of entry. The second time they threatened to have me arrested for trespass. She looked at him steadily. I told them to send the constable. And we'd discussed the matter with all the relevant documents present. They didn't come back. But they will. The silence was different now. You've been holding this house against Caro's people, he said, for 4 months. Alone. I've been practical, she said. For the second time, something shifted in his face. Not softness, not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition, the expression of a person who has encountered an unexpected symmetry. They'll come back, he said. Yes, when they do, he said slowly. It would be useful to have the actual owner present. That it would be considerably useful, she agreed. They came on a Friday. 9 days later. 2 men in a hired coach, which Eliza saw from the upstairs window before they were halfway up the drive. She recognized the taller one. Hewitt. Caro's land agent, who had been the second visit, the one with the constable threat. The other she didn't know. She went downstairs. Dominic was in the study. He had been in the study for most of the past week, working through his father's logbooks and a set of correspondence she had not known about, which he had found in a locked drawer whose key had been in the shaving kit all along. She knocked once and opened the door. They're here. She said. That he looked up from the desk. He had the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for something and is not surprised to find it arrived. Both of them. He said. 2. Hewitt and someone knew. That he closed the logbook and stood up. She watched him do something she had not quite seen before. He became, in the span of perhaps 15 seconds, a different thing. Not different in his face or his posture exactly, but in his bearing. The way he occupied the room changed, the set of his shoulders, the angle of his chin. He was still the man who had lit the kitchen fire badly and fixed the fencing and sat up with Thomas. But he was also, suddenly and completely, the Duke of Ashford. And she understood for the first time the distance between those two things and why he had kept them separate. That he walked past her into the corridor. She followed. That he opened the front door before Hewitt could knock. The effect was immediate. Hewitt had raised his hand to knock and now stood with it suspended, and the look on his face was the specific look of a man whose approach has been planned for a situation and who has found the situation to be entirely different from the plan. Demar. Hewitt. Dominic said. Hewitt recovered. He was a professional. I wasn't aware the property had. I was told the estate was unoccupied. You were misinformed. That I represent Lord Caro's interests in the matter of the outstanding debt on this estate, and I have. I know who you represent. Dominic said. I know the figure on the debt, the date it was incurred, and the terms under which it can be called. I also know that you have visited this property twice in the past 4 months and on both occasions attempted to intimidate a member of my household into abandoning the premises. He paused. You should know that I keep records. Hewitt's jaw tightened. Your Grace. You'll have a response to Lord Caro's correspondence within the week, Dominic said. Through the appropriate legal channels, with appropriate legal representation. If you have further business that requires a physical visit to this property, You will write in advance and receive either a confirmation or a refusal. If you arrive unannounced again, I will treat it as trespass." He looked at the man beside Hewitt, who had not yet spoken and appeared disinclined to start. "Do you have anything to add?" The man shook his head. "Then I won't keep you," Dominic said. "The road back to the village is passable as far as the crossroads. After that it's worse." That he stood in the doorway and watched them walk back to the coach. He stood there until the coach had turned at the bottom of the drive and disappeared between the elms. Then he stepped back inside and closed the door. Eliza was standing in the entrance hall. He turned and looked at her. The Duke had gone back, or partially back. The bearing had settled from authority to something quieter, but it had not entirely disappeared. She thought it probably never did entirely. "Once you had seen it, the correspondence," she said. "You found something in the study, enough to contest the debt's legitimacy." He said. "The original loan was made under terms that Caro altered after my father signed. It's in the logbook for 1848. My father noted the original terms precisely because he was a man who wrote everything down." Something moved in his face. "It won't be fast." "But it's possible." She looked at him. "You said you came to sell the house." She said. "That I did, and now," he looked at the staircase. At the stopped clock. At the line of afternoon light coming through the window above the door, falling across the flagstones in the same place it had always fallen. "That I came to sell the house," he said again. Slowly, "because I believed there was nothing here worth keeping." He paused. "I'm no longer certain that's true," she did not answer. There was nothing to answer, yet, but she looked at him. And she did not look away. The solicitor came from Maidstone on a Tuesday. Dominic had written to him 10 days after Hewitt's visit. A letter composed with the care of a man who understood that every word in it might eventually be read aloud in a room he was not present in. He had not said everything. He had said enough. The solicitor, a Mr. Pierce, who had managed the Ashford estate accounts since 1844 and who had, to his credit, continued to do so through 7 years of absence and mounting debt without once writing to suggest that the situation was hopeless, arrived at 10:30 on a grey Tuesday morning with a leather case and the expression of a man prepared for difficulty. Eliza had made herself scarce. This had been her own decision. Dominic had not asked her to, and when she had said, at breakfast, that she and Thomas would be in the kitchen garden during the meeting, something in his face had shifted in a way she was learning to read. "You don't have to," he had started. "I know," she said. "I want to." She was not sure this was entirely true. She wanted to stay because she had spent 4 months managing this house and she felt, in some part of herself, that she could not fully justify legally that its affairs were partly hers. But she also understood that Mr. Pierce would have questions about the presence of a woman and child in the house, and that those questions would complicate the meeting in ways that Dominic did not need right now. And that the most useful thing she could do was be absent. She was practical. She had said so. She took Thomas to the kitchen garden and watched him excavate the corner of the wall with his stick, and she listened to the sound of male voices from the study window above, not words. Just the cadence of serious conversation, the particular back and forth of men working through a problem, and she thought about what it would mean if the debt could be contested. Whether it changed anything. Whether, if Dominic kept the house, she was still in it. "Mama." Thomas said. "Is the man going to stay?" She looked at her son. He was covered in dirt and holding what appeared to be a piece of old clay pipe with the focused reverence of a significant archaeological discovery. "I don't know," she said. "I want him to stay," Thomas said, with the simple directness that she had given up trying to complicate with nuance. "He knows things about the garden, that's a reason," she allowed. "Do you want him to stay?" She looked back at the window. The voices had stopped. A long silence. The kind that meant something was being read or considered. "That I am thinking about it," she said. Thomas appeared to find this satisfactory. He returned to the clay pipe. Pierce left at 2. She heard the coach from the kitchen garden and brought Thomas inside through the scullery and busied herself with the afternoon fire, giving him time. When she came to the study doorway, he was standing at the window with his back to her, and she waited. "The debt is contestable," he said, without turning around. Not certainly. But possibly. Pierce thinks 18 months to 2 years. If we find the original correspondence and if I can locate a witness willing to speak to the committee terms. He paused. If we lose, Caro takes the house and there's nothing left, and if you win. He turned then. He looked like a man who had been handed something he did not yet know how to hold. If we win, he said, the debt is voided. The house is clear. He looked around the study at the logbooks, at his father's desk. At the correspondence spread across it. Pierce also thinks with the right representation, with the original documents there may be grounds to reopen the question of the verdict itself. She was quiet for a moment. The verdict from 1849. Yes, that would require evidence I may have. He said. In this room. My father wrote everything down. He looked at the logbooks again, and she saw his throat move. He knew, I think. He knew something was wrong before I did. He kept records of conversations, dates. Specific wording. He didn't know what he was recording. He stopped, practical, she said softly. He looked at her. Something in his face broke open slightly, not enough to be called grief in front of a witness, but enough. He was. He said, she came into the room and sat down in the chair across from the desk, the chair she had not sat in before, because it was his, and looked at him. Sit down, she said. It'll help you go through them. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had first seen in the gallery. In front of his father's portrait, unperformed, unmanaged. Then he sat down, and pulled the nearest logbook toward him, and opened it. They worked through the afternoon into the early evening, while Thomas fell asleep on the study sofa under Dominic's old school coat, which had materialized from somewhere and which Thomas had claimed without asking. She read and he wrote, and sometimes they talked about what they found. And sometimes they were simply quiet in the way of people engaged in shared work. The fire burned and she rebuilt it twice. He brought tea at some point, without announcing he was going to, and set a cup beside her without comment. She did not think about what this was. She would think about it later. The weather turned in December, not dramatically. There was no single day of it, no storm that marked a boundary. It was the gradual, grinding turn of an English winter arriving with the particular thoroughness of something that knew it had time. The temperature dropped and the mud froze and the wind came from the northeast with a consistency that found every gap in the window frames. And they moved through the house's rhythms accordingly, more wood, earlier fires, the particular domestic algebra of making warmth in a building that had not been maintained for warmth. Thomas had adopted the kitchen as his domain. He had, through some process of negotiation Eliza had not witnessed and did not entirely understand, arranged with Dominic that he would be taught, on certain afternoons, the correct names of the tools in the old workshop off the stable yard, chisels and gouges and the long-handled implements whose purposes she did not know, but Thomas was rapidly learning. She had found them there one afternoon, Dominic holding a gouge to the light to show the angle of the edge. Thomas watching with the expression he used for things he was absolutely serious about. She had stood in the doorway and not gone in. There was something in the scene, the low winter light, the smell of old wood and machine oil, the patient specificity of the instruction that she did not want to interrupt. She could not have said precisely why. She only knew that she stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, and then went back to the house. That night, after Thomas was in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with the order book and wrote a new entry. She did it with the care she gave to important records. December 4th, workshop, D, teaching T, use of tools. Light good until 3. East gutter holding. Flour low again. Note. The house is different than it was in April. She looked at what she had written. She crossed out the last line. Then she wrote it again, that he found her on the stairs on a Thursday evening, sitting 3 steps from the bottom with a candle and the letter. She had not planned to read it again. She had read it in June when she arrived, and twice in September when she was uncertain. And she had told herself after September that she was done with it because the letter said what it said, and reading it more frequently did not change its contents. But it was December now, and things had changed in ways that the letter had not anticipated. And she had taken it out of the oilcloth in the trunk where she kept it and sat down on the stairs with it the way you sat down with something you needed to think alongside. She heard him on the landing above and did not put it away till he came down and stopped 2 steps above her. He looked at the letter. She held it out that he sat down on the step above her, which put them at an odd angle, her looking up at him. Him looking down at the page, and read it was not a long letter. His mother had not been a woman who used more words than necessary. It said that she had heard of Eliza through a mutual acquaintance, that she was sorry for her circumstances. That the hall was empty and likely to remain so for some time, that she was welcome to make use of it as she needed, and that there were keys with the post office in the village. It said one other thing, at the end, in handwriting that was slightly different from the rest. As though it had been added after, "The house has been sad for a long time. Perhaps you will be good for it." He read this. He read it again. He folded the letter carefully and held it for a moment before handing it back. "When did she write this?" He said. "The date on it is March 1855. She tucked it back into her pocket. For months before she died that he was quiet. She knew the house was sitting empty," Eliza said. "She knew what she had, she always knew what she had." He said. It was not a simple statement. It had 7 years of weight in it. She turned to look at him. He was close. The staircase was not wide, and 2 people sitting on adjacent steps in a narrow stairwell were necessarily close. She could see the exact quality of his tiredness in the candlelight. The specific lines of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had recently, cautiously, begun to set small pieces of it down. "She wrote to me once," he said. "In 1852. After my father died. I got the letter late 6 weeks, and by the time I replied he stopped. I don't know if she received it. She would have kept it if she had." Eliza said. "There may be." She paused. "In the trunk in the attic. Where I found the shaving kit. There were letters in it. Bundled. I didn't read them." He looked at her. "I read the logbooks." She said. "I thought those were. I thought that was different. But the letters were letters." She met his eyes. "I have read a great deal of your family's private documents. Am aware that's not. You kept the house." He said. "You kept Caro's men out for 4 months, and you kept the logbooks, and you fixed the things you could fix." He looked at the candle. "I think my father would have said that earned it." She did not answer. The candle flame moved. "I think about leaving," she said. It came out more directly than she had intended. "Sometimes. When I try to be practical about it. Thomas is older now. I might find work in a larger town. Something more established." She looked at her hands. "And then I think about where." "Exactly. And I find I can't." She stopped. "Can't what?" He said. "Can't make it feel real," she said. "Another place. I can describe it. I can't make myself believe in it." He was looking at her steadily, with the same quality of attention he brought to the logbooks, careful, complete. "Missing nothing. That I told Pierce," he said slowly, "that the house was occupied. That there was a household here." He paused. "I didn't describe it as temporary." She looked at him. "I am telling you because you should know." He said. "What I said." "Not." He stopped. "Not because I'm making a decision for you. I'm telling you because you have a right to know how I describe things, and to tell me if I describe them wrong." The candle had burned down nearly to the saucer. "You didn't describe them wrong," she said. He nodded. A small motion. He stood up from the step and offered her his hand, which she took. It was practical. The stairs were dark. She had a candle in her other hand, and she stood up, and for a moment they were simply standing in the narrow stairwell in the near dark. Close enough that she could see the exact line of the groove on his left hand where the ring had been. She knew when he had sold it. She had looked up coach fares from Dover once, working backward from the night he arrived. She had not told him that either. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. She went up the stairs to her room, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. And she thought about a woman who had died in July with a letter sent in March and a house she had called sad for a long time. "Perhaps you will be good for it," she pressed her hand flat against the bedspread. The wool was rough and real under her palm, she thought. I think it has been good for me, she thought. I think it is not only the house I mean. She did not write this in the order book, the letters were in the trunk, as she had said that he found them on a Saturday morning in December, when the frost had made the upper floors cold enough that his breath showed. And he had gone to the attic for the extra blankets she had mentioned in September and had not yet retrieved because September had been before Hewitt and before Pierce and before the study became a place he spent his days. The trunk was where she had described it against the north wall, under a sheet, with the shaving kit still in its oilcloth on top. He opened it for the blankets and found also, beneath them, a bundle of letters tied with household string, his mother's handwriting on the outside of each one. That he sat down on the trunk and looked at them for a long time without touching them. The frost had got into the attic and the light came through the small window at a low winter angle and he sat in tea and breathed and did not reach for the bundle immediately because he understood that reaching for it was a thing he could not undo. That he reached for it. There were 11 letters. 7 were addressed to his father, dated between 1847 and 1849. Which meant they were letters written when his parents had been in different places, his mother in Bath for her health and his father at the Hall. The ordinary correspondence of a long marriage. He did not read those. He set them aside with the care he gave to things that were not his to open. 3 were addressed to him. He looked at the dates. November 1849 written before she would have heard what had happened. March 1851 written after. Jan. Uri 1853. The third one had been opened and refolded. The first 2 had not. That he opened the November 1849 letter first. That it was short. She said she had heard from his father that he was settling in London well, and she was glad, and she hoped the winter was not treating him too badly. And she had found a receipt for the apple cake he had liked as a child and had written it out and enclosed it in case he wanted it. The receipt was there, in her handwriting, on a small piece of paper folded inside. That he held the receipt for a long time. That he opened the March 1851 letter. She knew by then. She wrote, I will not say what I think about the men who have done this because I have been told my letters may be read before they reach you and I will not give them the satisfaction. I will say only that I know my own son and I know what he is made of and I have never in 30 years had cause to doubt Eth. Your father is not well. He asks about you every day. I am telling you this not to make you feel worse but because I think you should know that you are thought of, that this house thinks of you. That I light a candle for you on Sundays in the chapel and will continue to do so for as long as I am able. That he put the letter down on his knee. Outside the frost window the elms were bare against the white sky. That he opened the January 1853 letter. The one that had been opened before. Dominic. Your father died on the 14th. I expect you know this by now. I sent word through 3 separate channels and I trust at least one has reached you. I am not writing to tell you news. I am writing because this house is very quiet and I am in it and I wanted to write to you. That is all. I have been thinking about what is worth saying and what is not, and I find that most things are not, and the only thing that is this. Come home when you can. Not for the house. Not for me. Come home because you have been away a long time and long enough is long enough. I have left the key with the post office. Your mother. He sat in the attic for a long time. She had come down for him once. He understood she had left the key. She had written the letter. She had told a woman she had never met that the house was available because she had understood, in the way she had always understood things about him before he understood them himself, that the house sitting empty was not right. That the house needed someone in it who was waiting. Even if the person it was waiting for did not know it was waiting, she had not lived to see him come back, but she had arranged it anyway. That he folded all 3 letters and put them back with the others and tied the bundle with the household string and placed it back in the trunk exactly as he had found it. He took the blankets. He took the receipt for the apple cake, which he folded into his breast pocket. That he went downstairs. Eliza was in the kitchen with Thomas, going over his letters she was teaching him to read, had been since October. With a patience and specificity that he had watched from doorways several times without announcing himself. He stood in the doorway now and she looked up and saw his face and said nothing. only held his gaze for a moment with the quality of attention that she gave to things she was taking seriously. And then looked back at Thomas' work that he set the blankets on the chair, that he took the receipt out of his pocket and set it on the table beside her. She looked at it. She looked at the handwriting. She looked up at him. Do we have the ingredients? He said. She looked at the receipt again. Most of them. I'd need dried apple from the village. I'll go. He said that it was the first time he had offered to go to the village. She understood what it cost. She could see it in the way he said it, not the flatness of a decision already made but the slight roughness of one being made as it was spoken. 7 weeks he had been here and he had not gone to the village, had not stood in a place where people might know his face or his name or what had been written about him in the papers in 1849. Thomas can go with you, she said. He knows the way. Thomas looked up from his letters with the expression of someone whose afternoon had just improved significantly. I know where the dried fruit is, Thomas said. Mrs. Holt keeps it behind the counter because otherwise children take it. Do children take it? Dominic said. Thomas considered this with great seriousness. I have never taken it, he said. But I have thought about it. Something shifted in Dominic's face, not quite a smile, but the shape of face makes in the moment before one. Then we'll conduct ourselves honestly, he said. Get your coat. She watched them go from the kitchen window. Thomas was talking before they had reached the gate, gesturing at something in the hedge with the comprehensive explanatory energy he brought to subjects he considered important. Dominic was listening. His hands in his coat pockets, his shoulders not quite as tight as they had been 2 months ago. She turned back to the kitchen table and Thomas' letters and the smudged attempts at E and L and I on the practice paper, and she sat down. And she thought about a woman who had written "Come home when you can" and had not been there to see it. She thought, someone should tell him that. She would have been glad. She thought, I think he knows. But someone should say it. She did not know, yet, whether she was the right person to say it. That he came back with dried apple and also, inexplicably, a small paper of cinnamon, which he set on the table beside the receipt without explanation. It wasn't on the list, she said. No. He agreed. She looked at him. He looked back with the particular expression of a man who has done something he is not going to account for. She took the cinnamon. They made the cake in the late afternoon, the 3 of them. Which was not how she had planned the afternoon, but which was what happened. Thomas' contribution was enthusiastic and imprecise and resulted in a quantity of flour on the floor that she chose not to comment on. Dominic followed the receipt with the focused attention he gave to things he was doing. For the first time in a long time, reading each step before he executed it, not rushing. The kitchen was warm. The cake smelled exactly like what it was. An old receipt followed carefully in the house it had come from. They ate it at the kitchen table after supper. Thomas ate 2 pieces and fell asleep on the bench shortly after. Which was not the approved arrangement but which she allowed because it was December and the kitchen was the warmest room and he had had a long day. Dominic ate his piece of cake slowly. The way he ate things he was paying attention to. It's right, he said finally. It tastes right. She did not ask him what it tasted like. She could see what it tasted like. Your mother, she said. I think she would have been glad that he was quiet. Oh no, you came back, she said. I think she would have been very glad that he looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. I know, he said. I think I've known it since the attic. He paused. It helps to hear it, she nodded. The fire settled. Thomas breathed in the slow particular rhythm of a child deeply asleep. The cake receipt was on the table between them. His mother's handwriting visible in the candlelight. She had been thinking, since the staircase, about what she had not said. The things she had kept, the initials on the shaving kit, the logbook dates, the calculated coach fares. The careful reconstruction she had done in the long evenings of June when she had first understood who the house belonged to and what that meant. She had kept them because it had not been the right moment, and then because she had not known how to begin. And then because the longer she kept them the larger they had become, and large things were harder to put down than small ones. There's something I should tell you, she said. That he looked at her. He had the quality of stillness he used when he was prepared to hear something difficult. That I knew, she said. When you arrived. Not immediately, not when you were standing in the doorway. But that night. After I went through what I knew and what fit, and she paused. The shaving kit had your initials. I had read your father's logbooks. The last entry in 1849 described you leaving. You looked like the portrait in the gallery. She looked at her hands on the table. I knew by morning. Possibly before more. Ning that he said nothing, that I didn't say anything because she stopped. She had rehearsed this part and found, now, that all her rehearsed versions were wrong. Because you had come back to a house that had taken everything from you and then given it away to a stranger. And you were standing in it in a ruined coat in the middle of the night, and you hadn't eaten properly in days, I could see that, and you had just— She stopped again. You had just told a child you might not be staying, and you'd said it honestly. Which meant you were trying to be honest even when honesty was difficult, and I thought. She looked up. That I thought that whatever you needed this place to be. For as long as you needed it, I could let it be that. Without you having to explain yourself to it. She held his gaze. That's why I didn't ask. Not strategy. Not leverage. I just thought you deserved a place where you didn't have to answer for yourself the moment you walked in. The kitchen was very You've known for 2 months, he said. Yes, and you didn't. He paused. You never used it. No, he looked at her for a long time. She made herself hold the look because she had said the thing and it was true, and she was not going to qualify it into something smaller, the initials on the kit. He said finally. D.H. Yes, you put it in the washstand drawer in June. I thought it should be somewhere useful, she said. In case someone needed it. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the shape of one acknowledged. The cinnamon wasn't on the receipt. She said. No, he agreed. Why did you buy it? He looked at the receipt. At the cake. At Thomas asleep on the bench. At her, because she would have used it, he said. She always added something that wasn't in the receipt. She said receipts were starting points. Not instructions. He paused. I thought if I was going to do it, I should do it right. She looked at him. She thought. He went to the village for the first time in 7 weeks to buy dried apple for a dead woman's cake recipe, she thought. He bought cinnamon because she would have, she thought. I am not going to be able to make myself believe in another place. I have known this for some time. I am only now admitting it, she said. I think she would have liked you doing it right. That he said. I think she would have liked you. The candlelight moved. Outside. The December wind found a gap in the east window frame and the flame bent and recovered. Thomas slept on. The receipt lay between them on the table, the handwriting still clear. She did not say anything else. There was nothing else necessary. Yet. But she looked at him across the table in the warm kitchen of the house his mother had left open for her, and she thought that she understood, now, what the letter had meant. The house has been sad for a long time. Perhaps you will be good for it, she had thought, in June. That it meant her. She understood now that it had meant both of them. Caro came himself in January. She had not expected this. Caro did not, as a rule, conduct his own errands. She had people for that, layers of people. Each one a degree further removed from anything that could be traced back to him directly. That was how he had managed it in 1849, and that was how he had managed everything since, at a distance, through intermediaries. With clean hands. The fact that he had come himself meant something had changed. She saw the coach from the upstairs window, a better coach than Hewitt's, for horses. The Caro crest on the door panel. She stood at the window for a moment and then went to the study. Dominic was at the desk. He had been at the desk since early morning. Working through the final set of his father's correspondence with the focused efficiency of a man who understood he was running against a clock. Pierce had written in the new year. There was a sympathetic ear in the committee, but it required documentation, and it required it soon. Before Caro's people had time to anticipate the approach and close the door, she said, "It's Caro." He looked up. Something in his face went very still. Himself. He said, himself. For horses. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him set down his pen with the precise care of a man who was making sure his hands were doing nothing uncontrolled. How long? He said. 2 minutes. Perhaps 3. He stood up. He did not do the thing she had seen him do with Hewitt, the 15 seconds of deliberate recomposition, the visible assumption of authority. He did not need to this time. He was simply himself. Standing in his father's study in front of his father's desk, and it was sufficient. Stay in the house, he said. That I will not. Eliza. He looked at her directly. Please. Not because I don't trust you. Because I need to know where you are. She looked at him. Fine. She said. I'll be in the kitchen. The window faces the drive. The corner of his mouth moved. I know it does. That he walked out of the study and down the corridor, and she went to the kitchen, and she stood at the window. Carol was a tall man, which she had not known. She had built him, in her mind. From his method small, she had imagined, the way men who worked through intermediaries were often small, compensating, but he was not small. He was 60 or near it, gray-haired. With the upright bearing of a man who had spent 40 years being correct in rooms where being correct mattered. He came up the drive without hurrying. He carried a walking stick he did not appear to need. Dominic opened the door before he reached it. She could not hear what was said from the kitchen window. She could see it, the two men on the front steps, Carol looking up at Dominic with the expression of a man assessing a situation he had expected to find differently arranged, Dominic standing in the doorway with his hands at his sides and his weight even, not leaning. Not defensive. She had seen him do this with Hewitt. She understood now that it was not a performance. It was simply how he stood when he had decided something. Carol said something. Dominic said something. The exchange was shorter than she expected. No more than 2 or 3 sentences from each of the men. Then Carol made a gesture with the walking stick, indicating something, possibly the house, possibly the grounds. And Dominic shook his head once. She pressed her fingers flat against the cold glass. Carol reached into his coat and produced a document folded, thick. The kind of document that had been prepared by someone. He held it out. Dominic did not take it. He looked at it and looked back at Carol and said something that she could see, from the angle of his jaw and the particular stillness of his posture. Was not a refusal so much as a conclusion, the kind of thing you said when you had already made a decision and were informing the other party of a fact. Carol lowered the document. For a moment neither of them moved, then Carol said something else. Shorter this time. 1 sentence. Or close to it. And she saw it, even from the kitchen window. Even at that distance she saw Dominic's posture change. Not collapse. Not flinch. A very small tightening. The kind that happened when something had found a precise location. She was already moving before she had decided to move. She came out of the kitchen door and around the side of the house, and she was on the front steps before she had fully worked out what she was going to say. Both men turned to look at her. Carol with assessment, rapid and dismissive, the glance of a man cataloging a variable. Dominic with something that was not quite alarm and not quite relief and was possibly both simultaneously. Lord Carroll. She said. She had not planned to use his name. It came out with a certainty that surprised her. Carol looked at her with the unhurried attention of a man who had assessed women quickly all his life and was confident in his assessments. She could see him doing it, the dress, practical and plain. The hands, not soft, the manner, which did not match what he had expected from a woman standing on the doorstep of a contested estate in January. That I don't believe we've been introduced, he said. No, she said. We haven't. I am the person who told your man Hewitt, in September, that he had no right of entry. And in November. I am also the person who has been maintaining a record of every visit your representatives have made to this property since July, including the threats made on the second visit, which were witnessed and are documented. She held his gaze. I mention this because you are holding a document that I suspect involves the debt on this estate, and I want you to know before we proceed further that anything discussed here will also be documented. And that Lord Ashford's solicitor in Maidstone has a copy of the existing record. Carol looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at Dominic. She speaks for your household. He said. She does, Dominic said. Without hesitation, something moved in Carol's face the first time anything had moved in it. He looked back at Eliza with an attention that was no longer dismissive. The debt is legal, he said. Whatever Pierce has told you. The debt may be legal. She said. The terms under which it was incurred are a separate question. That's a question for solicitors and committees, not for visits to the property in January. She paused. If you have a legal document to serve, you can serve it through Mr. Pierce. If you are here for another reason, I'd ask you to tell us what it is plainly, because we are busy people and it is very cold. Caro was still looking at her with that new quality of attention. You've been here since July, he said. April, she said. A silence. That he doesn't deserve your loyalty, Caro said. It was said simply. Without heat, a statement of fact, as he saw it. That's not for you to determine, she said. Another silence. Longer. Caro looked at the document in his hand. He looked at the house. He looked at Dominic with the expression of a man revising a calculation he had been certain of. My solicitor will be in touch, he said. He said it to Dominic. But his eyes moved to Eliza once more before he turned. They stood on the steps and watched him walk back down the drive to the coach. They stood there until the coach had turned and the sound of the wheels had faded into the winter distance. The elms were bare on both sides. The frost had not lifted all day. She became aware that she was cold. She had come outside without her coat. Dominic turned to look at her. She looked back at him. What did he say? She said. Before I came out. The last thing that he was quiet for a moment. That he said there was no version of this that ended well for me. He said. That I should take the settlement and go. He paused. He said that whatever I'd built here was temporary. That it would be taken, the way everything had been taken. And that I was a fool to think otherwise. He looked at her. He said I had nothing worth keeping. She held his gaze. You have the logbooks, she said. You have Pierce. You have the correspondence. She paused. You have the cinnamon receipt. That he looked at her for a long moment in the January cold. And she could see him taking it in. Not the list, but the fact of the list, the fact that she had made it, the fact that she was standing on the steps in the frost without her coat because she had heard him say something that needed to be contradicted and she had come out to contradict it. Eliza. He said, yes, why did you come out? She thought about the true answer. She thought about whether this was the right moment for the true answer. And she concluded that it was because Caro had just said nothing worth keeping, and she found she was not willing to let that stand unchallenged for another hour or another day or another week of careful waiting. Because you have been here for 10 weeks, she said. And in that time you have fixed the fencing and sat up with a sick child and gone to the village for the first time since you arrived to buy dried apple for a dead woman's cake recipe. She looked at him steadily. And because when Caro said you had nothing worth keeping, I was standing in the kitchen window and I thought. She stopped. What did you think? He said that I thought he was wrong. She said. And I thought someone should be standing next to you when you told him so. That he was very still. The frost lay on the drive between the bare elms and the sky was white and cold and she was standing in it without a coat and she was not going to be the first one to look away. That I looked she said. In June. After I found the shaving kit. I calculated the coach fares from Dover. I wanted to know how long you'd been traveling before you arrived. How long you'd been. She stopped. I knew you'd sold something. You came with almost nothing, and the fares are what they are. And I wanted to know. She looked at the groove on his left hand. The ring. You sold it in Dover. He looked at his hand. I've known that since June, she said. I've known all of it since June. And I have not. She paused, and said it plainly. I have not said any of it, or used any of it. Because it was yours to carry and not mine to put down for you. She held his gaze. But I want you to know that I know. I want you to know that I know exactly what it cost you to come back here, and I think it was the right thing to do, and I think you should stay. That he was silent for a long time. Beck. Oz of the house, he said. The legal case. Not because of the house, she said. The words sat between them in the cold air. Not because of the house. He repeated slowly. No. He took one step forward. She did not step back. He was close enough now that she could see the exact quality of his expression, which was the expression of a man who had spent 7 years being certain of what he deserved and was being asked, for the first time, to revise the certainty downward towards something better. "I don't know how to do this," he said. It was said with the same flatness he used for facts. There hasn't been anyone, since before. I don't know if I'm capable of. "I don't need you to be capable of everything at once," she said. "I need you to not sell the house." Something broke open in his face. "Not grief this time." "Something on the other side of grief. That I am not selling the house," he said. "Good," she said. That he reached out and took her hand, which was cold from standing in the frost without her coat, and held it in both of his, which were warmer, and looked at her with an expression she did not try to name because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. "Come inside," he said. "You're freezing." "That I am," she agreed. They went inside. Thomas found them in the kitchen 20 minutes later. Having been nowhere in evidence during any of the preceding events, which Eliza suspected was not entirely coincidental, he looked at them with the frank assessment he brought to changed situations, registered whatever he registered, and said, "Is the bad man gone?" "He's gone." Dominic said. "Will he come back?" "Possibly. But it will be different next time." Thomas considered this. "Different how?" "Different because next time we'll be ready for him." He paused. "We have better records than he does." Thomas appeared to find this satisfactory. He climbed onto the bench and looked at the remaining portion of the apple cake, which had been living on the kitchen shelf for 3 days and was diminishing slowly. "Can I have some?" he said. "After supper," Eliza said. "You always say that." "It's always true." Thomas subsided, not without protest, and applied himself to the letters Eliza set in front of him. Dominic sat down at the other end of the table and picked up the page of Pierce's correspondence he had brought from the study and continued to read it, and Eliza began the supper, and the kitchen was warm. And outside the frost held the grounds in its January quiet. She listened to Thomas sound out his letters, the careful, concentrated effort of it, the small triumphs and corrections, and she listened to the turn of Dominic's pages and the settling of the fire. And she thought about a letter that had said the house has been sad for a long time, and looked around the kitchen at the fire and the cake on the shelf and the boy doing his letters and the man reading at the table, and thought, "Not any more." She did not write this in the order book. Some things did not need to be a record. Some things were simply true, and stayed true, and did not require maintenance. Spring came to the hall in the way it always had, grudgingly at first. Then all at once, there was a week in late February where the frost held so hard that the kitchen pump froze each night and had to be coaxed back to life each morning with hot water and patience. And then one morning in the first week of March Eliza came downstairs to find the pump working freely and a smell in the air that was not winter, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and breathed it in and thought, "There it is." The legal proceedings had begun in January and were moving with the particular deliberate momentum of things that had been set in motion correctly and could not now easily be stopped. Pierce had been to London twice. There had been a letter from a man Dominic had known at Oxford who as now on the relevant committee and who had, upon receiving Pierce's preliminary documentation, written back in terms that Pierce described as cautiously encouraging, which was, Pierce explained, as close to enthusiastic as committee correspondence ever got. The debt question and the verdict question were being treated separately, for tactical reasons. The debt first. It was more concrete, more documentable. The kind of thing that committees understood because it had numbers in it. The verdict was longer, more complicated, required more witnesses. But it was moving. Caro had not come back to the house. He had sent a letter through his solicitor in February, formal and cold, which Dominic had read and set aside with the expression he used for things that were unpleasant but not surprising. "He's waiting," Dominic had said, "to see which way it falls." That he should have thought about that in 1848, Eliza had said. Before your father wrote it down. That he had looked at her with the expression that was not quite a smile and was becoming, she had concluded, her favorite thing about his face. She was in the kitchen garden on the first warm morning in March when Thomas came running from the direction of the old dairy with the purposeful urgency he brought to significant discoveries. "There's something growing," he said, "by the dairy wall. You should come." She followed him around the side of the house, along the path she had cleared in the autumn, past the corner where the stone from the alleged Roman road was still being investigated at irregular intervals. By the dairy wall, the south-facing one, which caught the most light, something was coming up through the ground. Green shoots, half an inch out of the earth, arranged in a rough cluster along the base of the wall. She crouched down and looked at them. She had not planted these. She had planted things in the kitchen garden, herbs. Practical things, but not here, not along the dairy wall, which she had never touched because it faced away from the kitchen and she had not thought about it. What is it? Thomas said that I am not sure. She looked at the shoots, at the spacing, at the way they came up. Roses. Maybe. Possibly very old ones. She sat back on her heels. They've been here a long time. I think. They were just waiting for someone to clear the ground. She had cleared this path in October. She had not known she was clearing anything. She had been practical. Thomas crouched beside her and studied the shoots with the same focused attention he brought to the Roman road project. Will they flower? By summer, if they're what I think they are. Maybe earlier. What color? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. That he considered this. I don't mind waiting, he said. I want to know what color. She looked at her son, the top of his head, bent toward the small green shoots with complete attention, and thought about April. When she had come through the gate with one bag and the key from the post office and the knowledge that this was the last address she had, and if it didn't work she didn't know what came next. She thought about the way the house had felt then, stopped, cold. The particular silence of a place that has been holding its breath. That it was not holding its breath anymore. She heard the study window open above her. She could tell which window by the sound. She knew all of them now. In Dominic's voice, Pierce's letter came. She stood up. And a pause. Come inside. She looked at Thomas. 5 more minutes, she said. Then come in. He was already measuring the spacing between the shoots with a stick, because he was Thomas. And because everything was a project. Dominic was at the desk with the letter when she came in. He had read it at least twice already. She could tell by the way he was holding it, not reading but looking at. Which was different. She sat down in the chair across from him and waited. The committee has agreed to review the debt, he said. The original terms are sufficiently documented. Me father's logbook entry, the letter from Caro's solicitor that contradicts it. And 2 witnesses Pierce found who were present at the verbal agreement at the club. He set the letter down. Caro's solicitor has been given 30 days to respond, and the other matter. He was quiet for a moment. Pierce believes the debt review will establish enough of a pattern, he said, to support the reopening of the 1849 case. Not immediately, but within the year. He thinks. He looked at the letter. He says the man at Oxford, the one on the committee, has indicated that there are others who have had cause to question Caro's methods. That I am not the only one with documentation. He paused. That I was, perhaps, the most visible case. But not the only one. That she looked at him. That must be. She started. Strange, he said. Yes. He looked at his hands on the desk. I spent a long time believing it was only me. That there was something specifically about me that had made it possible. That I had miscalculated something. Trusted someone I shouldn't have, left some door open that a more careful man would have kept shut. He paused. Knowing that it was a method, not a judgment. That it was not personal, in that way. He stopped. Does it help? She said that he thought about it honestly. The way he thought about things, yes and no, he said. It helps with the part of it that I made into a verdict on myself. It doesn't change. He looked at the window, at the March light coming through it. It doesn't change the 7 years. Those were real. The people who left. The letters that went unanswered. Those were real choices that real people made, and knowing Caro had a method doesn't. He stopped again. That it doesn't give them back, she said. No. He looked at her. But it changes what I do with it. Going forward. He said this last part carefully. As though he was placing it precisely. She understood what he meant by going forward. They had not talked about it in explicit terms. They had not talked about many things in explicit terms. had been moving toward them obliquely in the way of two people who were both accustomed to managing alone and were learning, carefully, not to. Since the frost steps in January there had been small things, the way he stood closer than he had before. The way she had stopped leaving a room when he entered it, the way Thomas had begun, with the calm certainty of a child who had already decided something, to call him by his name without the "sir." "There's something else in the letter," Dominic said. She looked at him. "Pierce has raised the question of my formal return," he said. "To London." "To the title." "To—" he made a slight gesture that indicated the sum of things. "He says it's a process. There are appearances required, documents. The formal restoration of what was." He paused. "He says it will take time, but it's possible. That it should be done properly, when?" She said that he suggests spring. "When the committee has given its preliminary response on the debt." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about London. She thought about what a formal return meant, the appearances, the documentation. The public version of who he was becoming again. She thought about what it meant for the house, which had been a hiding place and was now something else, and about what it meant for her. Which was a question she had been turning over for several weeks without arriving at an answer she was certain of. "You'll have to go," she said. "Yes." He was watching her. "For a time. Note it wouldn't be permanent. The house needs—" He stopped. "I don't want to leave the house will be here," she said. "Thomas and I will be here." That he was still watching her, with the quality of attention she had long since stopped trying to deflect. "That is that what you want?" he said. "To still be here. When I come back." She looked at him across the deck at the logbooks on the shelf behind him. At the letter in his hand, at the groove on his left hand that was shallower now than it had been in November, she had noticed, the way she noticed things. "That I told you in January," she said. "That I couldn't make another place feel real, you did. That hasn't changed." That he set the letter down. He stood up from the desk and came around it, and she stood up from the chair. And they were standing in the study in the March light with the window open and the smell of the grounds coming in, cold soil and new growth, and somewhere, faintly, the green of things beginning. That he raised his hand and touched her face, briefly, with the back of his fingers, the careful, deliberate gesture of a man who was not rushing anything, and she turned into it slightly. "The way you move toward warmth, when I come back," he said. "I'd like to know what color the roses are." She looked at him. "Thomas is measuring them with a stick." She said. "That I know. I saw from the window." The corner of his mouth moved. "I want to see them myself, then come back before summer." She said. "That I will," he said. She believed him. Not because he had promised. He was not a man who made promises lightly. Which meant the ones he made carried the full weight of what he was, but because he was looking at her with the expression that was not quite a smile and was her favorite thing about his face, and because behind him on the shelf were 30 years of his father's logbooks. And on the desk was a new one, begun in November, in his own handwriting, and the most recent entry read, "March 8, Pierce's letter arrived. Preliminary findings favorable. Weather. First warm day. The kitchen garden is showing new growth along the dairy wall. Source unknown. Says possibly roses." She had read it that morning, before he was up. She had not told him that either. "Some things you kept, not as leverage and not as secrets. But because they were your small warm facts held privately, the way you held things that mattered," she would tell him eventually. She told him most things. Eventually, outside, Thomas was still measuring. The shoots grew.